Welcome back to Miles Reads. I'm Miles. Today, we're diving into a masterpiece that decodes the very essence of life, the gene, an intimate history. I'll be distilling the book's core insights as we explore a central question. How is genetic research poised to revolutionize our world? A few years ago, actress Angelina Jolie underwent a preventive double mastectomy to lower her risk of breast cancer. For a Hollywood star, this was undoubtedly a monumental decision. Jolie explained that her mother had battled cancer for nearly a decade before passing away at the age of 56. She didn't want her own children to endure the same heartbreaking loss. Jolie's choice was backed by rapid advances in genetic science. Scientists have identified a specific breast cancer gene, and women who carry it have up to an 80% lifetime risk of developing the disease. Through genetic screening, Jolie discovered she carried this gene. After the surgery, her risk plummeted to just 5%. Jolie's case makes one thing clear. For diseases like breast cancer, which are triggered by specific genetic mutations, scientific progress allows for more effective prevention. Following this logic, if everyone could easily get their genome sequenced, and if scientists could identify all the genetic mutations that cause major diseases, could we all foresee our inherited risks and live longer, healthier lives? The answer is both yes and no. Most diseases aren't like this type of breast cancer, determined by a single definitive gene. Many are the result of numerous genetic variations interacting with environmental factors. Genetic sequencing and screening won't instantly unlock the mysteries of human life, they have merely lifted a corner on a chaotic and complex world. The book's author is Siddhartha Mukherjee, whom many readers will know from his other masterpiece, The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer. After finishing that book, Mukherjee found himself asking, if cancer is an abnormal variation of an organism, what then constitutes the normal variation and inheritance of life? The result was this equally detailed, engaging, and humanistic work, The Gene, an Intimate History, can even be seen as a prequel to The Emperor of All Maladies. In late 2016, Bill Gates named it one of his 5 favorite books of the year. Genetics is a leading field of research today, and the life sciences built upon it are central to future technological development. We hope it will yield cures for terminal illnesses and unlock the secrets to health and longevity. Some even hope to use gene editing to eliminate disease-causing genes and insert superior ones, creating a new human. Yet, beyond the cold, hard facts of scientific progress, genetics is deeply intertwined with humanistic concerns. How much of our identity comes from heredity, how much from our efforts, and how much is simply due to chance? The Gene masterfully balances both science and humanity, offering a fresh interpretation of fate and choice from the microscopic perspective of our genes. I will guide you through the book's key points with 3 questions. First, how should we really understand what a gene is? Second, will genetic research challenge the theory of evolution? Third, what are the key future directions for genetic research? First, let's tackle the initial question. How should we really understand what a gene is? What is a gene? The technical definition is the basic physical and functional unit of heredity. In simpler terms, all aspects of an organism's life, its birth, growth, aging, and death are tied to the information stored in its genes. Since genes are information storage units that influence every aspect of a living being, it's natural to assume that the human genome contains a precise blueprint for building a person, determining all our physical and psychological traits. In other words, if you had a person's complete genetic code, you could clone an identical copy of them. However, the gene shows us that this view is far too simplistic, too black and white. The reality of the genetic world is far more complex, even chaotic, than we imagine. In fact, the information stored in most genes is less like a blueprint and more like a recipe. The biggest difference between a blueprint and a recipe is this. A blueprint allows you to manufacture a product with no variation, creating thousands of identical copies. A recipe, on the other hand, only specifies the steps. The final flavor of the dish varies from person to person. No one can make 2 batches of cookies that taste exactly the same. The recipe analogy helps us better understand how genes influence our physical and mental development. Just as a recipe has a sequence, with earlier steps having a greater impact on the final product, genes also operate in a similar hierarchy. For example, when baking bread, the first step is mixing the dough, which requires a specific ratio of water to flour. Get the ratio right and you get dough suitable for baking. Add too much water, and you end up with a useless slurry. Similarly, genes that are upstream in a biological process often play a decisive role in the final product. Take the gene that determines an individual's sex. During embryonic development, everyone follows a sex recipe. The first instruction in this recipe is a master regulator gene called SRY, which dictates the entire process. Whether the SRY gene is turned on or off determines if an individual develops male or female biological characteristics. In one experiment, biologists activated the SRY gene in a female mouse embryo. The embryo developed complete male features, including a penis and testes, and after birth it was only attracted to female mice. But the SRY gene is just the first step in the recipe. It subsequently influences dozens of other genes, which in turn integrate internal signals like hormones and external ones like social and cultural influences to shape the vast diversity of an individual's sexual identity. In other words, the SRY gene's influence is decisive in determining biological sex. But an individual's sexual orientation is not determined by the SRY gene alone, it's the result of variations in other genes further down the recipe, interacting with the environment. The cancer gene carried by Angelina Jolie is also an upstream gene whose mutation largely determines whether a woman will develop breast cancer. However, when she might get it and what type of breast cancer she might develop are determined by other genes and environmental factors later in the recipe. Furthermore, not all diseases can be traced to a single master regulator gene, like this form of breast cancer. Schizophrenia, for instance, may be linked to dozens of related genetic variations, and since some of these variations may not even be activated, the result is a wide spectrum of mental states with varying degrees of severity. Genes don't just determine physical traits and cause hereditary diseases, do they also influence our personalities and talents? In other words, are our mental and psychological characteristics also determined by specific genes? On this topic, genetic research has historically been dominated by two extreme views: environmental determinism, which holds that a baby's brain is a blank slate shaped entirely by culture and upbringing, and genetic determinism, which argues that genes dictate our personality, desires, temperament, and behavior. Biologists have conducted numerous experiments to find the answer, and the results show that genes have a far greater impact on human temperament than most people imagine. One of the most famous areas of research involves identical twins raised in different environments. Identical twins come from the same fertilized egg and have identical genes. Some twins are separated shortly after birth and raised in starkly different settings. Tracking their similarities and differences decades later provides a window into the influence of genes on an individual. Researchers found that these separated twins exhibited astonishing similarities, such as comparable personality traits, hobbies, and even similar medical conditions. Some studies even found they had similar tastes in music, financial habits, and altruistic behaviors. This research proves that genes don't just determine our appearance, they also profoundly influence our personality. But does this mean genetic determinism is correct? Of course not. Look at it from another angle. Why do identical twins with the same genes, even when raised in the same environment, grow up to be distinct individuals rather than exact mirror images of each other? A simple answer is environmental influence. Even when growing up together, twins experience subtle differences in their external environments and have their own unique, random experiences. In fact, if one twin develops a hereditary disease like diabetes, the other is not guaranteed to get it, though their chances are much higher than average. This is because there isn't just one disease-causing gene. The activation of numerous genetic variations is closely tied to random environmental factors. We can think of twins this way. They are the same set of genes, evolving into two different versions of a life within the machinery of time and space. Genes only determine the base coat of their bodies and personalities. How an individual life ultimately unfolds is intricately linked to environment and chance. A serious childhood illness, a car accident in adolescence, the sweetness of falling in love, all of these are variables that shape an individual. The author offers a brilliant metaphor for this. Genes write the script for life, but they also leave room for improvisation. This sentence profoundly captures the meaning of life. Life is partly inheritance, but it always leaves space for chance and adaptation to environmental changes. Without variation, there would be no evolution and we would not exist. To summarize the first point, the biological information contained in genes is not a precise blueprint that dictates life's development, but is more like a recipe. The recipe outlines the process but cannot guarantee that every finished product will be identical. Genes shape our physical features and also influence our personality and temperament, but we cannot ignore the interactions between genes and their response to environmental changes. The author calls the interplay between genes and environment fate, and our response to it choice. While fate is largely determined by heredity, it is also deeply influenced by the environment, and the different choices made by different people contribute to the diversity and richness of our world. Next, let's explore the second point. Will genetic research challenge the theory of evolution? Our traditional understanding of evolution comes from Darwin. You're surely familiar with his two core principles: natural selection and survival of the fittest. For example, the reason giraffes evolved long necks is that, long ago, a grass-eating ancestor had a genetic mutation for a longer neck. During a drought, this mutation allowed it to eat leaves from higher branches and survive. This new gene was selected for and passed on to the next generation. Over tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, this accumulated, eventually resulting in the modern giraffe. But is there another possibility for the giraffe's evolution? What if, one day, an antelope started stretching its neck to reach higher leaves? Gradually, this became a habit, and the memory of this neck-stretching behavior was somehow encoded into its genes and passed on to its offspring. The next generation would then be born with slightly longer necks. After several generations, could an antelope become a giraffe? Can the external environment leave such a memory on our genes? And if so, can that memory be inherited? The gene recounts a true human story that sheds light on this. The story takes place in the Netherlands during the harsh winter of 1944. The German army had cut off all food and fuel supplies to the northern part of the country, plunging millions in cities like Amsterdam into starvation and cold. Daily rations were reduced to just 3 potatoes per person. Tens of thousands died of starvation, and the survivors were emaciated. This cruel, man-made famine inadvertently created a natural experiment. Researchers discovered that children who endured the hunger winter not only had stunted growth but were also more prone to chronic diseases like heart disease, osteoporosis, and diabetes. By the 1980s, when researchers followed up with the babies born during the famine, they found that those conceived during the starvation period grew up to suffer from the same chronic diseases as their mothers, such as obesity and diabetes. This is understandable. A fetus facing malnutrition in the womb will alter its metabolism to store more fat, which can lead to obesity and metabolic disorders in adulthood. But the most shocking discovery came in the 1990s. When researchers tracked the children of these individuals, the third generation, grandchildren of the famine survivors, they found that their risk of developing similar chronic diseases was also significantly higher. This case shows that the impact of the external environment on the survivors' genes was passed down to the next generation, and even skipped a generation. The genetic changes brought about by the Dutch hunger winter suggest a real possibility. Evolution might not only occur through the slow process of genetic mutation and natural selection, but also through drastic environmental changes that leave a memory on genes, passing those changes to descendants. Could this be another shortcut for organisms to adapt to their environment? Even if, in this case, the evolution led not to physiological improvement but to chronic diseases from overreacting to famine. Subsequent research on stem cells has also provided evidence for the existence of gene memory. Stem cells are pluripotent cells with the ability to self-renew, most commonly found in embryos. A fertilized egg divides to form an embryo, and the stem cells within it can differentiate into various organs. Although cells in different organs have the exact same DNA, their characteristics are vastly different. Embryonic stem cells can develop into any type of cell, but the reverse is not true. A skin cell won't one day wake up and decide to become a nerve cell, let alone turn back the clock and become a stem cell. Is this transformation irreversible? Researchers trying to convert skin cells back into highly versatile stem cells found that skin cells from young mice were much easier to convert than those from older mice. Why are the cells of older mice more difficult to rejuvenate? They believe the answer lies in the memory of the genes. Various responses to the external environment, such as the metabolic changes the body makes to cope with famine, are recorded on the genes and cannot be easily erased. These genes, marked by the stains of history, are harder to restore to their youthful state. We can use an analogy to understand this gene memory. Every cell that develops from an embryo possesses the same great book of genes. But over the course of a lifetime, due to environmental changes, different cells make their own annotations in this book, deleting a few sentences, adding a few words, underlining certain passages, and bolding others. In this way, based on the same great book, different cells create their own unique interpretations. To summarize the second point, the core of evolutionary theory is genetic mutation and natural selection. But as our understanding of genes deepens, we find that responses to drastic environmental changes can be firmly imprinted on our genes, forming a gene memory. If this memory can be inherited, it could become another shortcut for evolution, giving us a new understanding of heredity itself. Finally, let's explore the third point. What is the future of genetic research? Genetic research is one of today's leading scientific frontiers, and its two main future directions are gene diagnostics and gene editing. Let's first explain these concepts. Gene diagnostics involves sequencing and screening an individual's genes to determine their risk of developing various diseases, as well as predicting their physical traits, personality, preferences, and talents. Gene editing, on the other hand, involves repairing or replacing defective or disease-causing genes to prevent illness or even alter a person's character, preferences, or abilities. Gene diagnostics and editing have enormous potential in disease prevention and treatment. Currently, scientists have identified over 10,000 diseases caused by single gene mutations. With the completion of the Human Genome Project, the cost of personal genetic sequencing and screening will plummet. In the near future, everyone may be able to know what disease-causing genes they carry and their risk of various hereditary conditions. In the field of eugenics, gene diagnostics are already widely used, such as in prenatal screening for Down syndrome. In the future, the number of screenable disease-causing genes will grow. After screening, there are typically two options. One is for the pregnant woman to choose to terminate a pregnancy involving a fetus with a problematic gene. The other is, during in vitro fertilization (IVF), to screen multiple embryos and only implant those without disease-causing genes. But both approaches face profound moral dilemmas. As the number of screenable genes increases and the risk associated with some genes becomes weaker, the ethical quandary of this choice becomes more pronounced. For example, if a screening shows that an embryo has a 5% chance of developing a certain cancer, would you choose to terminate the pregnancy? For adults who have already been born, the choices are even more limited. When you discover through genetic screening that you carry a high-risk mutation, there's often little you can do. The author even coined a term for this situation, a pre-survivor, meaning someone who is not yet sick but is already seeking to survive. To return to Angelina Jolie's example, when she learned of her extremely high risk of breast cancer, her choice to have a mastectomy was a pre-survivor's choice. Others might opt for regular checkups and undergo surgery only upon discovering an early-stage lesion. None of these approaches can guarantee that the disease will never develop, but they can reduce the fear of cancer. Curing diseases by modifying defective genes in the body is theoretically possible. Biologists have tried using viruses as vectors to deliver corrected genes into human organs in hopes of repairing mutations. But in the late 20th century, such experiments ended in tragic failure after causing the deaths of participants and were promptly halted. However, temporary setbacks have not stopped progress in the field of genetics. In the last few years, gene editing technology, especially CRISPR, has become the brightest star in biological science. For the first time, it allows scientists to precisely cut and paste segments of DNA. While it is far from perfect in practice, it represents a quantum leap compared to previous techniques. Some biologists even predict that gene editing will combine with stem cell technology and nuclear transfer technology to eventually achieve a comprehensive revision of the human genome. This also means that genetically modified humans could become a reality in the near future. The moment we hear genetically modified, many of us instinctively feel uneasy. Genetically modified humans raise concerns on multiple fronts, with at least a few points worth deep consideration. First, our understanding of how genes work. The interactions between genes and the environment is still in its infancy. The genetic structure is incredibly complex, and the network of connections between genes has not been fully mapped. Because different genes occupy different positions in the recipe process, modifying one gene could trigger an unexpected butterfly effect, leading to unforeseen consequences for the body. Second, it's very difficult to define what constitutes a good gene versus a bad gene. This is not only because a gene's function depends on its interactions, but also because the same genetic variation can play vastly different roles in different contexts. For example, many of the genes that may lead to schizophrenia are also linked to creativity. Throughout history, many famous individuals suffered from mental health issues, such as the painter Vincent van Gogh, the writer Virginia Woolf, and the mathematician John Nash from the movie A Beautiful Mind. In the world of ordinary people, they might be seen as mad, but in the world of creators, they are hailed as geniuses. A similar analogy applies to people with autism. Some children may struggle with social interaction but exhibit extraordinary talent in areas like art or music. This may be one of the wondrous outcomes of nature's chance and variation. Third, using gene editing technology to create perfect babies would lead to serious ethical and social problems. Gene editing can not only fix defects but also insert genes that are not naturally present in humans. If we could isolate a longevity gene or an intelligence gene and insert it into an embryo, should we allow it? If such technology is extremely expensive and only affordable to the super rich, would allowing it to exist dramatically worsen wealth inequality and class stratification? Overall, genetic research is immensely beneficial for helping us better understand ourselves and predict our futures. Some scientists have already proposed sequencing the genomes of 100,000 newborns and tracking them throughout their lives to clarify the role genes play in determining physiology, disease, personality, preferences, and more. In recent years, the development of big data, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence has also provided biologists with more powerful tools. They can create genetic avatars or virtual twins for vast numbers of samples to model the various possible outcomes of the genetic recipe. This research could not only predict an individual's chances of developing heart disease or gallstones, but also infer their likely sexual orientation or even assess their risk of alcoholism. In the future, your genetic test report will no longer be a simple scorecard, but a probabilistic guide, revealing various future possibilities. It won't be like a resume that records your past, but a map that outlines your future tendencies. In short, you will have a manual for being a pre-survivor. To summarize the third point, gene diagnostics and gene editing are the two core areas of future human genetic research. Gene diagnostics will allow for more effective screening of fetal genetic diseases, while gene editing holds the promise of repairing genetic defects and even adding so-called superior genes. But just as with genetically modified crops, the future of genetically modified humans will continue to spark huge ethical debates. One thing is certain, however, with the help of technology, we will gain a deeper understanding of how our genetic recipe works and be able to make more informed predictions about our various future possibilities. That covers the essential insights from the gene and intimate history. Let us quickly recap. The biological world, unlike the physical or digital worlds, is defined by its inherent chaos and complexity. The gene, as the smallest unit of hereditary information, is no exception. We cannot understand genes through the blueprint model of the physical world. They are more like a recipe that outlines life's processes but cannot guarantee every dish will be identical. The interaction between genes and the environment shapes our bodies and personalities. It is precisely because this recipe leaves ample room for chance and adaptation that each of us is unique. A deeper understanding of genes has also begun to challenge the core tenets of evolutionary theory. Research has found that drastic environmental changes can leave a memory on genes, which can potentially be passed down to future generations. This fast-track evolutionary channel has given us a completely new understanding of heredity. In the future, gene diagnostics and editing are bound to see faster and bigger breakthroughs. Conquering cancer, preventing diseases, and extending lifespan will all heavily depend on these two technologies. However, as we face a future where human genes might be edited and combined as freely as those of transgenic plants, Mukherjee reminds us, life is so complex and diverse that it will never be easily tidied up by precise genome cutting and tailoring. That's all for today. Congratulations on finishing another book.